Okay, so this is the first lecture now of the macro part of this course. And so let's look at the slides. So typically in a macro course, what we do is we start in looking at supply and demand and the general things, which we've now done. And then we start to turn to what macroeconomists do. So what macroeconomists do is they essentially do two things, three things. The one thing they do that some of them do, not all of them do, but some of them do, is that they measure three key economic statistics. That would be production, prices, and unemployment. And as you'll see, the first three chapters we're going to deal with here deal with exactly those three topics: production, prices, and unemployment. Then you've got a group of macroeconomists who look specifically at individual topics within macro. Things like the banking system, the financial system, economic growth and development. And you'll see that we deal with those things after we look at these statistics. And then finally, there's macroeconomists who are engaged in public policy debates about fiscal policy and monetary policy. And as you'll see, the last part of this course deals with that. So with that said, let's look at the slides. So again, macroeconomists are looking at three things: how to measure production, which is what we're doing in this chapter; how to measure prices, which is what we're covering in the next chapter; and how to measure how many people are working, which is the focus of the chapter after that. This would be chapter 10. This would be chapter 11. And this would be chapter 15. Don't ask me why they made that chapter 15. You don't need me to repeat this, but I'll just underline here. That we're looking at basically as macroeconomists looking at inflation, unemployment, or employment, and production, and how to grow the economy. So the common statistic that's used by economists is called GDP, gross domestic product. And you've probably heard of that acronym before in the news. What we're going to be doing here is we're going to be measuring. We can do this in one of two approaches. There's two methods of doing this. Either we can measure the income of everyone in the economy, or we can measure how much everyone is spending. Regardless of which option we choose, option one or option two, they all equal each other. Income must equal expenditures. So the two have to equal each other. You'll use the method that works with the data that you have. Now, the reason why this is the case, why income has to equal expenditures, goes back to the circular flow diagram. If you remember, we'd have firms and we'd have households. Firms sell products, households sell labor. Firms pay wages, households buy products, pay a price for them, presumably. In essence, the black should equal the purple in this picture here. Everything spent on everything spent should equal your income that you're receiving, and you get that income by having sold something. Or we can, I don't preview these slides before I start talking about them, or we can look at this much prettier picture right here. In this case, the red equals the sea green. But but essentially, firms use their revenue from sales to pay wages to workers, rent to landowners, and profit to firm owners. Total wages, rent, and profit paid by firms in markets. That equals what was used by the households to buy the goods and services. So, what is the gross domestic product? It is the final market value of all the goods. I guess I put it here. I would have put it right here, but whatever. Market value of all final goods and services produced within the country in a period of time. All three parts of this definition are important. And I guarantee you that when it comes time to the exam, your questions will differentiate between these three components. How does that emerge? Well, one example we're going to see here very shortly is that General Motors or Toyota, when it makes a car, buys tires. And it puts those tires on the new car that you then buy. But at the same time, we're not going to count when you then buy that car, we're not going to count the tires again. The tires only get counted once. And they get counted in the total price of the whole car. So, in that total price of the car, when this is counted, it avoids the tires being counted twice from when General Motors bought them from, I don't know, Michelin, right? We can't count those both. It's going to be counting whatever's produced in that country, regardless of that person's citizenship or nationality. We just count what's made within this country, and we typically do it over a period of time, most of the time a year. We are also only looking at goods that are legally produced in the market, and we're not looking at things that are made within the household. This turns out to get rid of a lot of potentially useful things from the economy. By that I mean, right after I get done making this lecture, I'm going to go home and watch my kids. Dude, my wife doesn't pay me to watch my kids, nor do I pay her when she's watching the kids right now. Now, if either of us were people of means, we could have sent our kids to like daycare, right? And paid daycare. That would have increased the GDP. But instead, because my wife and I are poor, we watch our own kids. That's not helping the GDP. Alternatively, what if I was engaged in creating a private lottery, which is illegal here in Hawaii, right? So I made like scratch off tickets and other kinds of betting games, and I started them all up in my house. And right, it's paying my salary. I quit my job as a professor. I'm going to now do this whole lottery thing. That's not going to be part of GDP because it's not a legal activity, but it is a useful activity, right? I mean, it is something that's being done. Whereas if I were doing my job in Vegas, right, I could be, I don't know, working for the state, running their lottery or something, right? I mean, the idea is that some of the things that are counted are only culturally determined, socially determined by the place where you are. Now this goes into those specific words. Final. Again, the tires are an intermediate good. They are used to produce the final good. The tires are used to produce the final good. That's going to be different than the tires wear out and then I go and buy some new tires. Those tires, the replacement tires, will be counted. I'm looking at goods and services. We're actually largely, much more so, a service-based economy. You, by paying your tuition right now, have bought a service. That service that I'm selling you, this class, is properly part of a educational service within the GDP. Tangible goods is a little bit easier to understand because it's just physical things being produced. And produced, I don't think we really need a definition of produced, but there it is for you. Within the country, again, regardless of nationality or citizenship, we are looking at what's made within this country's borders over a period of time. Now, the most common way to do this is going to be called the expenditure approach, where total output, which is Y, which is also GDP, is equal to everything that households spend on goods and services, plus what businesses spend on investment. Investment is essentially buildings, machines, inventory, products that are used to make other products. So this is not like an investment like buying a stock or buying bonds. It's the things within a factory that become the useful things to produce other things, like a building, like an assembly line, like a machine. Plus, government spending on goods and services. That would be like Medicare, Medicaid, building roads, paying me, right? All of these are things that the government, right? In this case, the government bought an economist for me, and I am teaching, right, for the University of Hawaii system, and right, that's the job that I then do for them. Plus net exports, which is equal to what we sell to the rest of the world, what we export, minus what we buy from the rest of the world, the imports. Now, I'm sure that the next few slides, without even knowing what's on them, I bet you they're going to explain each of these, but at least it gives you an overview of what's in each of these components. Let's start looking at the first. Look at that. Shedding the predictor. C. It's not just for cookie, it's also for consumption. In this case, it's what a household would spend on goods and services. Goods can be separated into two types, durable and non-durable. Durable goods are usually goods that last longer than 5 years. It's like a washing machine, a car. Non-durable goods, that'd be something like clothing, food. Services, that would be everything from law to education to going to the theater. All of those would be services. The only thing that's not part of consumption would be new housing. New housing would be part of investment. I myself bought a used house in the fall. That used house would not be part of the GDP because it was not a newly produced good. But you'd certainly know. I certainly paid a real estate agent, right? And I certainly paid different bank fees and whatnot. All of that would be services that I had paid for in this part of the GDP. Then we have investment. These are, again, the capital goods, the buildings, the equipment, intellectual property too. Then you've got the residential capital. This would be like homeowners, their new home, landlord with a new apartment building. And then we've got inventory, which is basically when the firm makes extra. And that extra stuff counts then, that they can then sell in a later period of time. Then we've got the government purchases, G. That would again be what they spend on goods and services. All levels of government. But it does not, and this is important, does not include transfer payments. Transfer payments are what you get just for being eligible for it. So, for instance, most of us got those like stimulus payments, right, because of COVID. That did not, was not G, because I wasn't being paid for giving the government any service, right? I just existed. So, because of that, that would be considered a transfer payment. When your grandparents get a Social Security payment, that's a transfer payment. But when your grandparents get Medicare, which is their health care from the government, that is a government purchase. It's a government purchase of health care. And then finally, again, we have the net exports, which is my exports minus my imports. What I sell to the rest of the world minus what I buy from the rest of the world. Oh, old data. Nothing worse than old data. I'm going to use my computer here to look this up at the same time. Where is Scheiding going for his data, you may ask? I go where all economists go for their data, if you're curious. We all go to Fred, which is fred.stlouisfed.org. Fred stands for Federal Reserve Economic Database, or Fred. Fred.stlouisfed.org. You'll get a website that I can then type in something as simple as GDP. And I'm just going to get what it is here as of Q4. So in 2020 is $18.780 trillion. Then by component, give me a second here. Boy, you'd think this would be easier. Okay, so I'm not getting good data here. So the other website to go to would be the Bureau of Economic Analysis, BEA.gov. They're the ones that manage the GDP data. So I wasn't getting very good GDP data from Fred. Fred actually gets the data from the BEA, if you're curious about that kind of thing. Probably not, but you're taking an econ class, so you should at least be somewhat curious about it. Let me just get the data here. So we're spending 1 second. Well, you can wait all I want because none of you are pressuring me. Oh, this is really bad data. I'm going to pause this while I find the data here. 1 second. Of course, right after I paused it, I found the information. So I'm getting it from the bea.gov website here. Consumption. Okay, it's actually giving me slightly different numbers here. For consumption, it's giving me 14.147. For investment, 3.6. For government spending on all of its various levels, 3.830. And for net exports, negative 0.645. If it's negative, that means we're importing more than we're exporting. It shouldn't be too unusual. Let's just now add this up. Such excitement. Yep. Adds up. I guess they were right. So if you're curious for this table, I can post this table as well, just in case you're curious. But it's coming from the bea.gov website, and I just looked under tables for GDP and got the data that way. So this is all trillions of dollars. So if we look at this, what's interesting about this is that the vast majority here, actually rounding it up, it's about 68% of the economy is all consumption. Investment spending by businesses is essentially 17.2%. Government spending is about 18.3%. And what everyone gets all hot and bothered about either way is international trade. International trade is only a few percentage points of the GDP. So that's again, rounding errors. This may add up to a little bit more, a little bit less than 100, but don't worry about that. It gives you a general scope of where everything is in this economy. And we could divide it out by person, and you can calculate these figures. But we can even see from 2015, that number hasn't changed very much. And it looks like right here. I just want to show you this. So I went to the BEA.gov website. I went by topic. I went by GDP. I then went to tables only. Then looked at table 3. And that's where I got my numbers here. I got my numbers from, sorry, my wife is calling me. Sorry about that. Oh, now it's really mad at me. Nothing is changing anything. I got my 20.9328 for total GDP. I got my 14.147, my 9.486, 3.60, adding up to the I38. It's a horrible way to do it here, sorry. $20.932, 14.14, 3.6, 3.83, for government spending, and then net exports being negative 645. Okay, let's go back to the slides. Now, one thing that's incredibly important to differentiate between would be the real GDP versus the nominal GDP. Real means that you take into account the price changes over time. Nominal means that you do not. So if prices were increasing over time, right? Let's just take like the classic thing that never changes in price, like the Costco hot dog, right? It's always $1.50. So if I just wanted to say how much was spent on Costco hot dogs in 2020, if I said $3, then I would know that 2 were made. And let's say in 2021, I said, okay, how many were made? And it was also $3. Nominally, I might be able to say that, or sorry, nominally, I'd be able to say still that 2 were potentially made. But what if I don't have any idea about the price? What if the price had actually doubled from $1.50 to $3 the hot dog? Then in real terms, only 1 was made. So there is a reason why you might want to take into account changes in prices. So if we're looking at things nominally, we're going to look at what their current prices are. So nominal GDP in year 1 is simply going to be the price in year 1 times the amount sold in year 1. Nominal GDP in year 2 is going to be price in year 2 times quantity in year 2. But real GDP in year 1 could be P1 times Q1. And if the base year is 1, then real GDP in year 2 would be P1 times Q2. See what's happening there with real? What's happening there with real is that my price stays the same. So the only way that real GDP can change is if the Q changes. How I picked this base year, that's just dependent on what you wanted to do as a researcher. But as real GDP points out here, you've got constant prices not affected by changes in prices. Whereas here, nominal GDP could go up because price is changing, but it could also be going up or down because the Q is changing. And generally speaking, if you're looking at GDP, you really are looking at whether Q is changing. You don't care as much about whether price is changing. And so here we get an example of how to work something like this out, where we would calculate from a nominal perspective. We take the prices times the quantity. Prices times the quantity. Prices times the quantity for each of those years. Same here. So for nominal, you're just doing kind of like a straight horizontal price times quantity, price times quantity, price times quantity. Where everything changes is now when I'm doing real GDP, I have to have a base year, 2019, which means now this is the only price that exists. This is the only price that exists. As you see here, the price of a hot dog is always $1 because that's the base year price. The price of a hamburger is always $2 because that's my base year price. But the quantity changes based on the year that it is. The difference being when this changes, it could either be because the price is changing, the quantity is changing, or price and quantity are changing. But when this is changing, the only thing that changes is quantity. The significance of that is that if you looked at nominal numbers, this was an increase by a factor of 6. Did the economy actually become 6 times larger? No. It actually was about 2.5 times larger. And the final thing we can do is calculate the GDP deflator. Which would be to take the nominal over the real and multiply by 100. So as you can see here, 200 over 200 is this 200 over this 200. 600 over 350 would be this 600 over that 350. And then this 1200 over this 500. That, those GDP deflator numbers can tell us about the changes in prices because we can calculate the percentage change. To go from 100 to 171 is a 71% change. Prices increased by 71% from 2019 to 2020. And that's what we see described here. It's our nominal GDP for a given year divided by its real GDP, multiplied by 100. And it allows us to determine what the general increase in the prices are. It's a way to measure the inflation rate, which is something we're going to look at in the next chapter. essentially our percentage change in the GDP deflator numbers. The internet is really cool, dudes, because the internet would tell us how much they've got percentage change calculators on there that can tell you exactly those things. I'm not going to look at this case study. You're not responsible for it either. I'm not going to look at this case study. Now, the GDP, how has it been changing over time? It's been roughly a increase over time. You'll notice here in these salmon colored marks, that would be a recession. And obviously, we had a pretty significant recession in 2008, 2009. The data, sadly, does not take us all the way out to 2020, but we can get it. Let's look for it. I'm going to look at this in real terms. And we'll see here that the significance of the pandemic was quite significant. We are currently in a recession, which means that we have at least 2 quarters of negative GDP growth in real terms. And that would be a pretty significant decrease in GDP. Right? If we take that out, that was like the economy going backwards for 5 years. In quarter 2, we were at 17,302. In approximately quarter 4 of 2015, it was about the same. So it was a significant, COVID-19 was a significant event on the economy. Now, the economy does slowly start to open up, but even then, with the most current data we have, 1878, that's still down from the 19.253. How much? It fell almost 30% in the second quarter to rise 30% from that in the third quarter, and is now dramatically slowed down. So this part where it's going down right there, where the increase has gone down quite a bit, that's the concern for the economy, that, or for economists right now, is that the economy is measurably slowing down its rate of increase, even though we're still pretty much in the throes of the pandemic. Now, I would generally agree with this. Our GDP is really our best measure of how the economy is doing. It's, again, our measure of total income and total expenditures. These are equal to one another. Generally speaking, and I know there's at least one of you who doesn't believe this, because there are other ways to measure prosperity in an economy, but generally, economists do believe that a larger GDP does mean a better life because of all the things that it means that it can afford. No, it's not perfect. If I were to send my kids always to daycare and then send them to boarding school and never spent any time with them, I'd be helping the GDP, but the kids might end up being really screwed up because they never had me in their life. Right? If I crashed my car into my wife's car on accident, that's a pretty bad thing, but it actually increased GDP right? We turn on the news and we always see bad things happening on the mainland, like, I don't know, snowstorms and car crashes and shootings and really bad things. All of those things increase GDP. But obviously, they're not things that we want to have happening. Also, the GDP doesn't say anything about the distribution of the income. And we obviously know that the income is not distributed equally across societies. Again, these case studies, I'm not holding you responsible for those. Um, so that's our introduction to GDP. And so I'm going to encourage you to do the practice questions that's going to help you now apply these definitions that I've talked about.